Welcome to what is intended to be one of the most detailed A-level revision guides available in either print or on YouTube on Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca. You can see what I'll be covering during the video, and you can skip to any of the coloured sections which are more useful to you by referencing the timings below. This video is long, I'm afraid, and so those of you with an attention span of a sparrow may struggle, but it will be useful. Get your pen ready to take some notes and stay tuned. This is a Schofield on Shakespeare Ultimate A-Level Revision Guide to Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca. I would argue that there are three distinct stages to the evolution of the character of the second Mrs. de Winter. First, her character as paid companion to Mrs. Van Hopper, subservient and lacking in confidence, which doesn't change significantly during the early months of her marriage to Maxim de Winter. The second stage, more assertive and confident, is triggered following Maxim's revelation that he killed Rebecca and didn't love her. The final stage is that of the older, wiser woman living abroad with Maxim and looking back on her earlier life at Manderley. The narrator's lack of self-confidence and experience is notable in the early chapters of the novel. After seeing Maxim de Winter at the hotel restaurant in Monte Carlo for the second time, I wished I was older, different, before going on to clumsily knock over a vase of flowers. This dissatisfaction with her evolving self, this frustrated knowledge of her own comparative chronic lack of experience with life, persists throughout her courtship and early married life with Maxim. Following Maxim's anti-romantic proposal, in which he charmingly refers to her as "you little fool," she replies slowly, "You don't understand. I'm not the sort of person men marry." When asked to explain, she goes on to reference her comparatively lowly status as part of the reason, but it is also clear that she hasn't herself yet worked out the kind of person she is, and so arguably isn't ready for marriage. However, the problem is that the reason Maxim de Winter finds the young narrator attractive is precisely because she is so comparatively young, precisely because she probably isn't ready for marriage. He repeatedly patronises her and praises her for the attractiveness of her youth and naivety. Following his marriage proposal, he says bluntly and insensitively, "It's a pity you have to grow up." This attitude continues as they arrive at Manderley. "Poor lamb," he calls her. "Run along and make friends with Mrs. Danvers," he patronisingly demands. And "my good child," he labels her during a disagreement following her discovery of Rebecca's illicit waterside cottage. This puts her in an almost impossible position. On the one hand, she is expected to be the perfect, competent hostess at Manderley and to independently manage servants. Yet on the other hand, her husband's language repeatedly implies that he sees her as endearingly immature, something he likes, presumably partly due to his torrid experience with a confident, fully functioning, self-determining female, Rebecca. And it is partly because the young Mrs. de Winter isn't yet mature enough to work out and accept who she is that she becomes so intimidated and obsessed by the spectre of the first Mrs. de Winter. Short of anything to do at Manderley, her mind has ample opportunity to speculate, recall and invent conversations about her. Following the disastrous fancy dress ball, she quotes verbatim what Maxim's grandmother, Beatrice and Frank have said about her before emphasising her mania. "Rebecca, always Rebecca. Wherever I walked in Manderley, wherever I sat, even in my thoughts and in my dreams, I met Rebecca. I knew her figure now. The long slim legs, the small and narrow feet, her shoulders broader than mine, the capable clever hands. She has never seen a photograph of Rebecca, yet this debilitating lack of confidence, yet her failure at this point of the novel to have built a relationship in which intimate feelings can be shared, combined with Mrs. Danvers' machinations, result in her spending more time visualising her rival within her mind than talking to her husband in real life. But the second Mrs. de Winter changes significantly when she finds out that actually Maxim didn't love Rebecca as she had thought. It doesn't make for sanity, does it? Living with the devil, he spits, referring to Rebecca, and this revelation causes her a tremendous rush of happiness. She writes, "My heart was light like a feather floating in the air. He had never loved Rebecca." Her simile emphasises her sense that a terrible burden has been lifted from her, which is both curious and ironic, given that she has also just found out that her husband is a murderer and therefore could potentially be hung, given that the novel was set in the mid-1920s and the death penalty was not abolished until 1965. This ecstatic reaction to the twin revelations suggests, problematically, that the narrator values the potential for personal fulfillment ahead of basic, commonly accepted moral codes, i.e., murder is a shocking crime which society needs to vigorously punish in order to keep us all safe. Of course, loyalty is expected within marriages, but such explicit sentiments of joy and relief co-occurring with a partner's revelation about a past murder is unsettling and disturbing. Blatant vows to lie and perjure and swear, blaspheme and pray arguably imply a selfish, distorted moral compass. Fueled by her ecstasy, the second Mrs. de Winter is able to become far more self-assertive, instructing her husband what to do when confronted with Rebecca's real body, addressing servants with authority, and even speaking peremptorily to Mrs. Danvers to explicitly dismiss past Rebecca-introduced customs. There is also a sense that these revelations have freed the narrator from the metaphorical repressive chains of youthful immaturity, which Maxim finds attractive only due to his own insecurities, and have finally unleashed her mature sexual self. She writes triumphantly, "I was free now to be with Maxim, to touch him and hold him and love him. I would never be a child again." Her use of polysyndeton, defined as the use of a conjunction, in this case and, between clauses, suggests a suddenly developed, overwhelming desire to possess her husband sexually, which is indirectly confirmed by her recognition that she is now ready to put her childish past behind her. Such sexual passion is confirmed at the end of chapter 25, the night before the potentially fateful visit to Dr. Baker and Barnet. When Maxim put his arms around me and lifted me against him, we began to kiss one another feverishly, desperately, like guilty lovers who have not kissed before. Of course, on one level, the boiling desire stems from a fear that the pair may not be able to experience such intimacy ever again. But it is also facilitated by the pair's recognition that the second Mrs. de Winter is a capable, loving, adult woman, able to make her own decisions and judgments. She is not a child caught in the nick of time before she has been able to develop fully, both physically and emotionally. By definition, one encounter is erotic, the other, arguably, paedophilic. The third stage to the evolution of the second Mrs. de Winter's character is seen, conversely, at the beginning of the novel, in which the narrator is older and living abroad with Maxim, as well as during certain flashes of the narrative when the narrator takes a step back to reflect. Here, the narrator comes across as scarred and scared by the past, but also fulfilled and unified in her marriage. She writes, either wisely or complacently, depending on your perspective, "I know we are together. We march in unison. No clash of thoughts or of opinion makes a barrier between us. We have no secrets now from one another." Implicit within this triumphant statement is the value of a fulfilling relationship above all else, which highlights the narrowness of roles and opportunities for women during this period. If you have been successful in your marriage, then, particularly as a woman, you have made it. The narrator herself confesses as such when she writes in chapter 18, "There was nothing quite so shaming, so degrading as a marriage that had failed." The narrator changes as the novel progresses, and so does Maxim, originally called Henry in Daphne du Maurier's initial plan for the novel, which was later changed as "Perhaps I thought Henry sounded dull." In Monte Carlo, he comes across as gentlemanly, well-bred, and a little abrupt, as seen in his skillful outmanoeuvring of Mrs. Van Hopper in order to ensure a more respectful treatment of her paid friend of the bosom, to use his satirically adopted term. He says to the pushy, social sucker-upper, "I'm afraid I must contradict you. You are both having coffee with me." His language is quietly authoritative and reflects his upper-class status, in which he is used to getting his own way and being obeyed. Maxim also shows himself to be quick-witted when he delivers this thinly veiled barb towards the gross American. "Don't let me keep you. Fashions change so quickly nowadays they may even have altered by the time you get upstairs." This refers to the fact a dressmaker is waiting for Mrs. Van Hopper in her suite, and the fact that the statement is so ridiculous, fashion trends do change quickly but not in minutes, hints at an overall attitude of dismissive flippancy towards her. However, this ability to successfully deliver a seamless sting is secondary to the essential rule of his clan, to be seen as well-bred and courteous irrespective of any irritancies. Maxim may be fastidious in his adherence to the social conventions of good manners, also seen in his squire-esque benignity and hosting of often tedious guests at Manderley. But in other ways he is less conventional. Following his invitation to the narrator to join him at his table for lunch after she has knocked over a vase, he says, "We needn't talk to each other unless we feel like it." This convention-defying lack of conversation does not result in any awkwardness either. The narrator observes that his quality of detachment was peculiar to himself, and I knew that we might continue thus, without speaking, throughout the meal, and it would not matter. There would be no sense of strain. So early in the novel, Maxim gives an impression of self-control, a degree of aloofness and self-containment, which rereaders will recognise is not just a product of his privileged, confident background, but also due to his need to keep his murderous secret permanently buried. Courteous, guarded, intelligent, Maxim is also clearly capable of kindness. Noting the narrator's fear whilst driving on a windy road by a cliff, he is reassuring. "Don't be frightened, the turn is far easier than it looks," before manoeuvring the car gently, very gently, until it faced the sloping road once more. The repetition of the adverb stresses his consideration for his passenger and chivalrous concern for her feelings. Another positive feature of his character is seen in his occasional poetic-esque appreciation of nature. Alone away from the strain and haunted memories of Manderley, he shares his love for his ancestral home and its setting. He told me how the sun set there on a spring afternoon, leaving a glow upon the headlands. The sea would look like slate, cold still from the long winter, and from the terrace you could hear the ripple of the coming tide washing in the little bay. The use of imagery, emphasising the smooth gleaming flatness of the sea on a calm day, as well as the wide use of senses, the tide is heard, the sea is seen, the water is felt, present Maxim as a sensitive man, finely tuned into and appreciative of the natural world. Maxim's self-containment in many ways is both understandable and laudable. Understandable as he has a terrible secret to hide, which could result in him hanging. Laudable as it helps him adhere to the traditional male stereotype of someone who is strong, independent, and doesn't feel the need to regularly whinge about his feelings. However, it unquestionably has a negative impact upon his relationship with his second wife, and results in significant, damaging misunderstandings. He tells the narrator, "All memories are bitter, and I prefer to ignore them. Something happened a year ago that altered my whole life, and I want to forget every phase in my existence up to that time. Those days are finished. They are blotted out." This is all very well, but it means that his new wife lands at Manderley without any idea of even the public facts of what happened to Rebecca, ironically meaning that, as his wife, she knows less than even your average newspaper-reading Joe from the local village. This results in her experiencing feelings of self-loathing as she half-guiltily listens to and occasionally tries to find out about small details about the past from other sources. In Chapter 11, during a conversation with Frank Crawley, she plucks up a puppy-like courage to shift the subject onto Rebecca. Following some questions, to which the answers would have been in the public domain, including how long afterwards was it that they found her, and where did they find her, her sense of self-loathing is shown as she self-castigates. "Suddenly I did not want to ask him any more. I felt sick of myself, sick and disgusted. I was like a curious sightseer standing on the fringe of a crowd after someone had been knocked down." But actually the narrator's comparison is not valid. As Maxim's new wife, she has a right to know the basic details of her predecessor's death, if only to ensure she has a chance of acclimatising successfully to her new role as the Lady of Manderley. How can she possibly deal with the inevitable reference in passing to Rebecca if she knows absolutely nothing about her? How is that fair? So Maxim's Stone Age man decision to blot out all references to the past from himself and his new wife only serves to increase the latter's paranoia and obsession about Rebecca, thus lowering her already fragile self-esteem and placing an intolerable strain upon their relationship. And there are other ways in which Maxim is selfish and thoughtless. It is he who determines that the wedding would be utterly non-romantic, over a desk with a licence, and then off in the car to Venice or anywhere you fancy. When the narrator tentatively suggests a more romantic, traditional alternative, his response is telling. You forget, I had that sort of wedding before. In other words, the wedding and the marriage are going to be all about him, his desires, his preferences and his needs. The fact that Maxim previously had a traditional church wedding before is relevant, of course, and needs to be taken into account, but it most certainly does not torpedo the possibility of a repeat if this is what his bride-to-be would like. His thoughtlessness is also seen in his failure to adequately prepare his new wife for her life and role at Manderley. He rushes back there from the honeymoon without bothering to consider whether a young woman previously employed as a friend of the bosom may have appropriate clothing for her new class-leaping position. Maxim's sister Beatrice comments critically, I wonder Maxim did not stay a week or so in London and get you something decent to wear. I must say, I think it's rather selfish of him. Thus, the servant's first impression of the narrator are tainted by the fact that she was unsuitably dressed, in a tan-coloured stockinette frock, a small fur known as a stone marten around my neck, and over all a shapeless mackintosh far too big for me and dragging to my ankles. It soon becomes clear, like Daphne du Maurier herself, that she has no idea how to deal with servants, but Maxim's lack of foresight puts her at a further disadvantage. It simply doesn't occur to Maxim that someone not brought up with servants may struggle to deal with them. Following the debacle over the breaking of the China Cupid, Maxim is astonished that the narrator chose to hide the pieces rather than ask Mrs. Danvers immediately to have them fixed. Railing against the extraordinary things that she does, he rebukes her incredulously. You scrape up the remains in an envelope and hide them at the back of a drawer, just like a between maid, as I said, and not the mistress of a house. Daphne's own husband, Tommy, was similarly exasperated by Daphne's lack of domestic competence. Is this another sign of Maxim's inability to empathise with his wife, perhaps in some part due to his overriding hidden fears about his past actions, or does it also give an insight into the far more vigorously defined roles of men and women of the period? The women were generally responsible for the smooth running of the household, whilst the men dealt with external matters, such as working to provide an adequate household income. The two were separate spheres, and just happened. Perhaps Maxim is more of a product of a time, rather than a particularly thoughtless oath in expecting that his new wife would be able to fulfil her side of society's implicit marital arrangements. Maxim's revelations about his true feelings towards Rebecca, as well as the fact he killed her, bring the couple much closer together. The narrator phrases it thus. It would not be I any longer. It would be we, it would be us. And this changed, more considerate, empathetic Maxim is seen during a heart-to-heart at the end of chapter 21. He tells his wife emphatically, I'm glad I killed Rebecca. I should never have any remorse for that. Never, never. But you, I can't forget what it has done to you. I was looking at you thinking of nothing else all through lunch. The problem is that this newly re-established emotional unity has come at a cost, arguably making the woman an accessory to murder. For in Rebecca, personal fulfilment is ambiguously prioritised ahead of justice. Rebecca famously never appears in the novel at all, and so we are forced to rely on second-hand sources for information about her. Second-hand sources such as Maxim and the narrator clearly have a vested interest in presenting her negatively, and one of the many interesting challenges for the reader is to consider the extent to which Rebecca's presentation is fair and balanced. The only first-hand material we have of her is a note she wrote to Jack Favell on the morning of her death, which gives little away. As this is the only source material we have, I have presented it in full. I tried to ring you from the flat, but could get no answer, he read. I'm going down to Manders right away. I shall be at the cottage this evening, and if you get this in time, will you get the car and follow me? I'll spend the night at the cottage and leave the door open for you. I've got something to tell you, and I want to see you as soon as possible. Rebecca. Other than the use of the nickname Manders, which is not used by anyone else in the novel and merely implies an upper-class jovial familiarity, the message is entirely functional and gives no new sight into Rebecca's character. The reader has already heard that she used to spend nights in her cottage to see men. This note gives superfluous confirmation of this. We therefore need to rely solely on the various second-hand sources who talk about her at different points of the novel. The ghastly Mrs. Van Hopper is the first to reference Rebecca and declares, I never saw her, but I believe she was very lovely, exquisitely turned out, and brilliant in every way. They used to give tremendous parties at Manderley. It was all very sudden and tragic, and I believe he adored her. Obnoxious she may be, and clearly keen to keep her paid companion in her place, but Mrs. Van Hopper does make it her business to find out as much as possible about rich celebs, and on this occasion her summary is accurate. Rebecca was almost invariably seen as generally brilliant and beautiful. The bishop's wife says exactly the same thing. Yes, she was a very lovely creature, certainly very gifted, very beautiful. Whilst Frank Crawley, when pressed, tells her marital successor that Rebecca was the most beautiful creature I ever saw in my life. The effect of these superlatives is to increase the narrator's sense of her own comparative inadequacy and plainness, which with time and loneliness contribute to her sense of paranoia. So from the outside looking in, Rebecca seemed to be the perfect wife. However, even before Maxim's bitter revelations to the narrator about his real feelings, there are intriguing hints about less positive sides to her character. Following the narrator's passionate tirade about her own comparative inadequacy, Frank Crawley rushes chivalrously to his employer's new wife's defence. He says this, I should say that kindness and sincerity and, if I may say so, modesty are worth far more to a man, to a husband, than all the wit and beauty in the world. Frank is the very epitome of cautious expression, and his use of the polite, prefacing, preparatory phrase, if I may say so, spotlights the subsequent noun even further than its position as third within the tricolon would already merit. The narrator is far more clueless about the exact meaning of modesty as used in this context than the reader, writing that it was a word I had never understood. I always imagined it had something to do with minding meeting people in a passage on the way to the bathroom. The reader cannot but laugh out loud at this manifestation of the narrator's naivety. Perhaps she is referring to an archaic idea of it being better, particularly for women, not to be seen by others going to the loo. Of course, she is very vaguely on the right lines. She recognises that he may be referencing private parts. But the rereader will be clear that Frank's use of this ambiguous noun is his delicate way of suggesting Rebecca wasn't always faithful to her husband, and therefore the narrator should stop upbraiding herself for her own inadequacies, as at least she gives the impression of 100% dutiful loyalty to her newest husband. Whereas Frank, and much later Maxim, is implicitly critical of Rebecca's unconventional sexuality, Mrs. Danvers eulogises about it. Admiration rings through her words in chapter 18 during her intense psychological bombardment of the narrator. They made love to her, of course. Who would not? She laughed. She would come back and tell me what they had said and what they'd done. She did not mind. It was like a game to her. Like a game. Who wouldn't be jealous? When summoned to the Colonel Julian Favell Maxim Crawley unofficial post-inquest summit in chapter 24, she says something very similar to the wider audience. Well, what if she did spend weekends with Jack Favell in London? She had a right to amuse herself, hadn't she? Lovemaking was a game with her, only a game. She told me so. She did it because it made her laugh. It made her laugh, I tell you. She laughed at you like she did at the rest. The phrase make love to is slightly ambiguous, in that prior to the early 20th century, it generally meant paying amorous attention or courting. When in Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, for example, Lysander complains that Demetrius made love to Neda's daughter Helena and won her soul, he's not suggesting vigorous copulation, but dogged wooing. In Rebecca, it seems to me as though both meanings are possible. Rebecca was both amused by and encouraged men to court her, and on occasion, and certainly with Jack Favell, had sex with them. Mrs. Danvers' words suggest that Rebecca had an unconventionally flippant attitude towards full sex and pre-sex discourse and activities, which is unsettling, particularly to both male characters and readers, used within patriarchal culture to viewing sex to a significant extent as an opportunity for triumphant male performance. That such a performance should afterwards result in the female rocking with laughter undermines traditional notions of masculinity in which the man is fated for his strength and virility. Indeed, Mrs. Danvers goes on to state Rebecca's attitude towards men even more explicitly within chapter 24. She tells the slathering Jack Favell, "She was not in love with you or with Mr. De Winter. She was not in love with anyone. She despised all men. She was above all that." All of a sudden it is possible to move away from the simplistic Maxim-inspired notion of Rebecca being a slut and a whore. Could it be more appropriate to label Rebecca a feminist hero, a woman living within a patriarchal society in which opportunities for women are severely restricted and refusing to conform to gender-based expectations? Throughout the novel, du Maurier repeatedly highlights Rebecca's lack of gender conformity. She had all the courage and spirit of a boy, the strength of a little lion, always lunched at her club in London, and spent many nights at the cottage, and had sailed in every sort of weather. If these characteristics and actions were to be applied to a man, the individual would be praised, even to some extent, for his sexual infidelity. "Oh, boys will be boys, all within the pub. Good on you, mate." Modern readers in particular are therefore far more inclined to consider Rebecca more sympathetically than the narrator Maxim and Frank. While sexual unfaithfulness within marriage is not to be applauded, her buccaneering insistence on refusing to conform to repressive gender stereotypes most certainly is. Frank remains Frank throughout and doesn't really change. Completely dedicated and loyal to Maxim, he provides much-needed support to the narrator during her early months at Manderley. Similarly to the narrator, he places personal loyalty ahead of justice and the legal system by doing everything in his albeit limited power to support his revered long-standing boss when faced with a closing in on the truth Jack Favell, even proposing to accept the latter's blackmail offer. It is clear to the reader and narrator that Frank knows the truth about Maxim's murderous act. Yet the fact he chooses not to say anything about this to Maxim highlights his own complacent acceptance of his subservient role and position, and also emphasises the complexities of human interactions. If two men who trust and have known each other for decades can have secrets half known and not fully understood, then what does that suggest about the potential for full and open communication between human beings in general? The fact that Rebecca attempted to seduce such a loyal follower is intended to illustrate the extent of her deviant and debauched sexuality. Daphne du Maurier changed the original name for Maxim's character from her initial plan, and she also made Mrs. Danvers more sinister. Why? I have no idea. In her initial notebook, there is no mention of Mrs. Danvers being the catalyst for the great fancy dress disaster, and it is a photo of Rebecca which triggers thoughts of suicide, rather than brilliantly timed, manipulative suggestions from Mrs. Danvers. For the Mrs. Danvers of du Maurier's published novel is indeed a mistress of manipulation, which is seen from the very first second of the narrator's arrival at Manderley. She has lined up the entire domestic staff to ostensibly appropriately welcome the new mistress of the house. However, with hindsight, her motivation is more focused on testing the new Mrs. De Winter and seeing how well such a young woman can cope with being presented with so many gawping judging faces within seconds of her arriving at such a well-known, prestigious country house. Maxim clearly knows that Mrs. Danvers has deliberately set up his formal welcome in spite of his own wishes, and swears under his breath to the narrator, "Damn that woman, she knows perfectly well I did not want this sort of thing." However, he is not sufficiently interested in Mrs. Danvers or the servants to ponder her motivations further, and indeed singularly fails to accept just how menacing and frightening a figure she presents to the narrator. Of course, unlike the reader, Maxim does not have the benefit of the narrator's descriptive prose. Surely more du Maurier than even a mature Mrs. de Winter looking back on her past, to alert him to the potential danger of Danvers. Her first description is of someone tall and gaunt, dressed in deep black, whose prominent cheekbones and great hollow eyes gave her a skull's face, parchment white, set on a skeleton's frame. Her deep black clothing does to some extent bow to mourning conventions, but also aligns her more closely to everything associated with that colour: darkness, death, and the devil. The overall effect is overwhelmingly disconcerting, and references to skull, skeleton, and parchment associate Mrs. Danvers ghoulishly with dead bodies rather than the living. The narrator maintains this use of morbid imagery throughout the novel when referring to Mrs. Danvers. She leaves her dead hand in the narrator's, stands at the top of stairs like a black sentinel, looks at the narrator with her white skull's face and her dark eyes, and has the face of an exulting devil following the success of her mission for the narrator to be humiliated for wearing Caroline de Winter's dress. So her physical presence deeply unsettles, but her appearance is merely a faithful reflection of her own obsession with the dead Rebecca, which becomes increasingly apparent as the novel goes on. So Mrs. Danvers' appearance unsettles the narrator, but it is also her poise, silence, and ability to time shifts in conversation that help her gain absolute power over the narrator for much of the novel. Following Maxim's early patronising bid for the narrator to run along and make friends with Mrs. Danvers, their conversation is initially characterised by conventional housekeeper-esque responses to questions. However, once Mrs. Danvers has established that her new mistress is weak and inexperienced, she simply stops talking for a short period and looks. The narrator writes, "There was silence between us. I wished she would go away. I wondered why she must go on standing there, watching me, her hands folded on her black dress." This tactic puts the onus on the useless with domestic help narrator to continue or end the conversation as she chooses. She doesn't have the strength or ability to do the latter, and so resorts to weak, phatic talk, which is inappropriate and isn't needed for those deemed your social inferiors. Having waited and used silence to weigh up, Mrs. Danvers is then able to use another weapon within her armoury, a sudden, intimidating change of tone. Her voice, which had hitherto, as I said, been dull and toneless, was harsh now with unexpected animation, with life and meaning. The change was so sudden that I was shocked and a little scared. I did not know what to do or what to say. As it happens, this change of tone has coincided with Mrs. Danvers mentioning Rebecca for the first time. Although this is deliberate and gives an early insight into the depth of her obsession, in a way, what she is saying is almost irrelevant. What matters is the unexpected change in her voice and how this tips the power balance unconventionally towards the paid employee. Similarly, in chapter 19, another tone shift so nearly pushes the narrator to commit suicide. "Why don't you jump?" whispered Mrs. Danvers. "Why don't you try?" With fog gathering around Manderley, and Mrs. Danvers' coaxing, quiet voice ringing in her ears, the narrator begins to assess the advantages and ease of this method of dying. It is only the sound of rockets being fired outside which snaps the narrator out of her Danvers-inspired reverie, which signal the fact a ship has gone ashore in the bay, which in turn leads to the discovery of Rebecca's real body and suspicious death. Thus, ironically, the dead Mrs. de Winter, whom Mrs. Danvers loves so much, both as a quasi-daughter figure and as a mad disdainer appreciative of her femininity and sensuality, is an indirect cause of her successor's life being saved. The novel ends with Maxim and the narrator driving back to Manderley from Dr. Baker's home in Barnet, with the former having a premonition of something being wrong. Mrs. Danvers has suddenly left the house without explanation and had received a long-distance call. The final two sentences imply that Manderley is on fire. and the sense is that it is Mrs. Danvers who has lit the blaze and so taken revenge on behalf of her beloved Rebecca. Thus, read intertextually with Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, which many critics have argued is a key inspiration for Daphne du Maurier's novel, her final act literally transforms her into the object of her obsession. It is Bertha Mason, Rochester's first wife, who burns down Thornfields. In doing the same, Mrs. Danvers figuratively becomes the similarly wronged, at least in her own mind, first wife who needs to take drastic action as a futile gesture against mistreatment and patriarchy. In the previous section, I introduced my first reference to Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, and it is worth exploring the similarities and differences between the texts in more detail. Both texts are about a wealthy male lord of the manor marrying a much younger second wife, who has previously been working as a paid employee within a domestic situation. In both texts, the first wife is discredited and is deemed to have behaved in mad, inverted commas, ways, thus meaning her death is seen as a blessed relief to the lord of the manor. At the end of both texts, the country estate is burnt down, indirectly resulting in a humbler, more humane lord of the manor, and a more equal relationship with his second wife. Maxim's marriage proposal to Rebecca is famously utterly unromantic. In addition to referring to her as "you little fool," the narrator notes that before she has responded to his proposal, he went on eating them his marmalade as though everything were natural. In books, men knelt to women, and it would be moonlight. Not at breakfast, not like this. In contrast, although there are ominous foreshadowing references to his first wife, and nature reacting violently to such an unnatural proposal, Rochester's proposal is characterised by his passion and very genuine torment about whether Jane will accept him. Whereas in Rebecca, Maxim reacts to the narrator's delay in responding by saying smoothly and ironically, "My suggestion doesn't seem to have gone too well." In Jane Eyre, the narrator notes that Rochester's face was very much agitated and very much flushed, and there were strong workings in the features and strange gleams in the eyes. Additionally, he exclaims, "Oh, Jane, you torture me. With that searching and yet faithful and generous look, you torture me." Although Rochester's decision to propose to Jane, even though his first wife is alive, is deeply problematic and causes Jane a great deal of suffering, there is no doubt that he passionately loves and desires her. In the quotations on screen, the repetition of the verb torture emphasises the fact that Jane's delayed response is causing him genuine physical and mental pain, whilst love echoes out of the adjectives he uses to describe the way she is looking at him. As Jane rather smugly and gloriously romantically goes on to say later, Rochester seems to understand and get who she is, because they are precisely suited in character. Perfect concord is the result. But the relationship between Maxim and the narrator and Rebecca does not cause the heart to rejoice and exult, as is the case in Jane Eyre. Maxim's apparent nonchalance and composure during his marriage proposal is a precursor to similar complacency, thoughtlessness, and lack of understanding or real concern about his wife's situation and feelings during the early parts of their marriage. Consequently, the narrator and Rebecca is far more dissatisfied with her life in the early months at Manderley after marrying Maxim, in a way that Jane isn't during her engagement at Thornfields. But this is not just due to her new husband's apparent lack of passion and demonstrative love, particularly when compared to his illustrative literary predecessor. It is also clear that the narrator of Rebecca does not possess the same strength of will or character as Jane, resulting in her coming across as puny and weak in her exchanges, both with her new husband and the domestic staff. In Jane Eyre, the morning after his marriage proposal, Rochester is on cloud nine and determined to make a tremendous fuss of his fiancée. He cries floridly, "I will myself put the diamond chain round your neck. I will clasp the bracelets on these fine wrists and load these fairy-like fingers with rings." Here is Jane's response. "No, no, sir. Think of other subjects and speak of other things and in another strain. Don't address me as if I were a beauty. I'm your plain, Quakerish governess." These words show that Jane is prepared to stand up to Rochester, to contradict him, and is determined not to lose herself in the fantasy Cinderella-esque world of glistening jewellery and pink palaces. Compared to Jane, the narrator of Rebecca is a wimp. She limply cedes to Maxim's rushed, non-romantic wedding day proposal, in spite of her own childish visions. And during their first argument about her decision to chase after Jasper the dog, who ran towards Rebecca's cottage, she is the one to desperately initiate peace, in spite of clearly being in the right. It is a good thing that she wanted to check that the dog hadn't fallen. Listen to her desperation to appease as she pleads, "Please, Maxim, please, please, Maxim. Let's forget all we said. A futile, silly argument. I'm sorry, darling. I'm sorry. Please let everything be all right." The multiple repetitions of please and sorry, and the overwhelmingly feeble plea for Maxim to magically make sure everything will be all right, highlights her own weakness of character, immaturity, and the imbalance within her relationship at this point in the novel. In Jane Eyre, the female heroine runs away from the man she loves due to her overwhelming sense of what is right and wrong. She sleeps rough, goes hungry, and takes on a teaching job towards which she is initially ambivalent in order to support herself and retain her independence. What reader of Rebecca can imagine the second Mrs. de Winter behaving with so much inner strength and determination? And you could argue that someone as principled as Jane Eyre might have found a revelation about murder as appropriate a catalyst as an attempt to commit bigamy. So an intertextual comparison between the two novels hammers home just how initially unsatisfactory and unequal the relationship is between the De Winters. It also slightly distances us from the narrator Rebecca, as we can't help but sigh at her comparative weediness, her insistence on absorbing herself utterly into Maxim's more dominant character. Even the names of the two novels are unwittingly insightful. Charlotte Bronte's novel is called Jane Eyre because there is something, a great deal in fact, to say about her character and the kind of person she is. Du Maurier's novel, in contrast, has to be named after the first wife, Rebecca, partly because there is so little to say about the second as an individual in her own right. No wonder Du Maurier never gives her a first name. Her choices and her flaccid acceptance of a particularly passive role as a woman within a patriarchal society means that she only ever exists as an insignificant extension to the control freak that is Mr. de Winter. In the world of Rebecca, women are judged predominantly in terms of their physical appearance and their adherence to convention. Newly informed of the looming marriage between Maxim de Winter and her paid companion, Mrs. Van Hopper ran her eyes over my figure. She went on looking at me in a way she had never done before, appraising me, running her eyes over my points like a judge at a cattle show. The imagery emphasises how demeaned the narrator feels, as though her complex humanity is being whittled down to merely an assessment of her possible sexual attractiveness for a man. Similarly, when the narrator meets Jack Favell for the first time, there is a sense of women being assessed solely for their sexual allure. He went on, looking me up and down in his amused way with those familiar, unpleasant blue eyes. I felt like a barmaid. Once again, the writer uses a revealing simile. Even in today's politically correct world, some barmaids will have an implicit understanding that their role is not just to pour beer to men with overhanging bellies, but also to flirt and use their femininity to make the men feel good about themselves, thus encouraging them to stay longer and spend more money. Here, the use of a barmaid simile to describe the feelings of the privileged, highly respectable new mistress of Manderley suggests that the narrator feels cheapened and degraded by Favell's blatant eyeing up of her body. Of course, Favell is generally unpleasant, and far more overt with his debasing male gaze. Nonetheless, there are other signs in the novel of women being firmly below men within the hierarchy. In chapter 9, the narrator observes her husband stroking her hand absently, not thinking, talking to Beatrice. She then reflects, "That's what I do to Jasper. I'm being like Jasper now, leaning against him. He pats me now and again when he remembers, and I'm pleased I get close to him for a moment. He likes me in the way I like Jasper." Implicit in these words is the existence of a hierarchical structure with men firmly at the top, women underneath, and not just in sex, and then much-loved animal pets beneath. Similarly, in Chapter 10, the narrator describes Maxim's behaviour following the resolution of an argument. The simile was my reward, like a pat on the head to Jasper. "Good dog then, lie down, don't worry me any more." I was Jasper again. The comparisons with Jasper suggest that men, or at least the men presented within the novel, are not tuned to see women in terms of equal companions. Even the harmonious partnership of Beatrice and Giles exists in spite of the latter's boorish attitude towards women. Referring to Mrs. Danvers, he roars with laughter as he points out, "She's no wall painting though, is she?" Rather, women, like dogs, are to be affectionately patted when convenient, looked at, taken for the occasional walk. Women, like dogs, are not there for sustained, meaningful conversation. The men would much rather return to reach for the newspaper on the arm of their chairs. This portrayal of the dynamics within male-female relationships contrasts with that presented at the end of Jane Eyre. The narrator declares that "we talk, I believe, all day long. To talk to each other is but a more animated and an audible thinking." Such communion of male-female spirits cannot, sadly, be realised within the misogynistic world of Rebecca. One of the particularly interesting themes in the novel is the contrast between appearance and reality. On the surface, Maxim and Rebecca had the perfect marriage, yet the reality is that they loathed each other. The ability of men and women to mask the state of their relationship to the external world is also seen within Maxim's second marriage and during the Manderley fancy dress ball. The context is that Maxim has just lobbed sharp, furious words at the stunned narrator following her Danvers-inspired decision to wear the dress modelled by Caroline de Winter within one of the house portraits. Rebecca wore exactly the same dress during the previous Manderley ball. There hasn't been a chance for the couples to discuss the incident, yet they have to present a united front to their hundreds of guests. The narrator watches the dancing couples and notes that it was not I who watched them at all, not someone with feelings, made of flesh and blood, but a dummy stick of a person in my stead, a prop who wore a smile screwed to its face. The figure who stood beside it was wooden too. His face was a mask, his smile was not his own. So the need to hide reality and save face, particularly within a society which values marriage so highly, can result in humans temporarily freezing their emotions and becoming like two performers in a play. Just as patriarchy is shown within the novel to figuratively dehumanise women, so the need to deceive others about the state of a couple's feelings towards each other can result in the participants suspending and closing off their human responses. The irony is that the aforementioned incident is itself caused by a lack of awareness of the reality of what triggered the narrator's decision to wear the dress, as well as why it has made Maxim so furious. Put otherwise, incorrect assumptions based on appearances result in the need to deceive others. The narrator thinks that Maxim still thought about Rebecca. He would never love me because of Rebecca, and so to some extent believes his fury stems from his rage at her presumption for trying to match such a peerless predecessor. Meanwhile, Maxim believes that the decision to wear the same dress worn by Rebecca the previous year was deliberate on your part. You had some bet that you would startle him, didn't you? Some foolish joke. Whereas the truth is that the idea was planted by their malign housekeeper. What du Maurier is emphasising here is just how easily misunderstandings can arise within relationships and how potentially corrosive these misunderstandings can become. It can also be argued that the likelihood of misunderstandings within relationships is increased due to the social historical context in which women's voices are seen as of secondary importance and interest. The patriarchal system thus directly results in a climate in which the gap between appearance and reality is wider than it needs to be, although there is no getting away from the fact that clear and successful communication is far from straightforward, especially between men and women. According to du Maurier's biographer, Margaret Forster, her father, the famous thespian Gerald du Maurier, regularly used to say to his daughter, "I wish I was your brother instead of your father." Rebecca is also full of similar curious reflections on the relationship and dynamics between youth and old age. Maxim is more than 20 years older than the narrator, and certainly at the beginning of the novel he might be seen as a more appropriate father figure than a husband. Following his marriage proposal, he asks the narrator, "Does 42 seem very old to you?" To which she replies, too hastily, too desperately, as usual, "Oh no, I don't like young men." In chapter 12, when Maxim once again points to the difficulties of a relationship with such a large age gap, the narrator's response is startling. "I love you more than anything in the world," she says. "There has never been anyone but you. You are my father and my brother and my son, all those things." It is perhaps fortunate that, as usual, Maxim is not listening, because closer contemplation of the narrator's language is unsettling. On one level, the naive young narrator is merely rephrasing the hackneyed phrase used by wretched lovers all around the globe, namely, "You mean the world, you mean everything to me." However, on a deeper level, there is something deeply disconcerting about allocating husbands, even figuratively, additional, technically impossible and incestuous family positions. A key role for a husband is to have sex with his wife, so that, with a bit of luck, they can have children. Indeed, thinking of the survival of the species, you could argue that this is the husband's key role. So to suggest a husband is my son or even my brother is a disturbing mishmash of roles and positions, which conjures up uncomfortable images of incest and blurred boundaries. We can speculate that Gerald du Maurier's own struggles to accept his daughter's transition from childhood into adolescence, and later desire to repress his messed up feelings by weird jokes wishing to be his daughter's brother, may have contributed to this unconventionally fluid concept of the potential roles within a family. Irrespectively, the desperation of the narrator's statement, and the fact the word husband is not even included within the list, suggests that the narrator is struggling to come to terms with what it means to be a wife, particularly such a young wife, to an older man as experienced as Maxim de Winter. Additionally, the absence of the word husband may imply that energetic sexual endeavour may not, at this point of the novel, be a key feature of their relationship. Perhaps the third part of the tricolon, the suggestion that the narrator wants Maxim to be her son, stems partly from her frustration at his insistence on treating her like a child. By definition, it is rather difficult for a son to treat a mother like a child. She expresses this frustration frequently during the novel, and most explicitly in chapter 16. Following a discussion in which the narrator has expressed her excitement about her secret costume for the forthcoming Manderley ball, she writes, "I wished he would not always treat me as a child, rather spoilt, rather irresponsible, someone to be petted from time to time. Would we never be together, he a man and I a woman, standing shoulder to shoulder, hand in hand, with no gulf between us? I did not want to be a child. I wanted to be his wife, his mother. I wanted to be old." In a similar way, just prior to the narrator's first arrival at Manderley, she writes, "It seemed remote to me, and far too distant, the time when I too should smile and be at ease, and I wished it could come quickly, that I could be old even, with grey hair and slow of step, having lived here many years, anything but the timid, foolish creature I felt myself to be." In both these quotations, being young is seen as a real disadvantage and barrier, something certainly countercultural to our modern world's thinking. According to the first quotation, if you are young, you are not taken seriously, and the result is an unsatisfying, unfulfilling relationship. And according to the second quotation, being young results in a crippling loss of confidence and difficulty in dealing with new people and challenges. Both statements strike a chord with the reader, but what shocks more are specific references to wanting grey hair and to be slow of step, and the effect of these lines is to emphasise the narrator's chronic lack of confidence in her comparatively young self. Perhaps the writer is suggesting that the price the younger woman pays within cross-generational marriages in terms of her confidence and mental well-being is too high. Irrespective of teenage angst and insecurity, something is surely wrong if we see hobbling and grey hair as preferable to energy and the excitement of a life to be lived. There is so much of interest to explore within Rebecca, and although I have optimistically titled the video Ultimate A-Level Revision Guide to Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, there are other areas worth probing. What about the novel's treatment of class, the past, and what about also spending a bit more time considering Daphne du Maurier's own life? For whilst her creation, the second Mrs. de Winter, was initially hampered by having nothing to do at Manderley, in contrast, du Maurier ended up the main breadwinner of her family due to the success of her writing. Daphne du Maurier also enjoyed having time to herself. She couldn't have survived spending every second looking after her husband Tommy, as Mrs. de Winter appears to do following the fire at Manderley and the move abroad. Still, I hope you have found this guide helpful and interesting, and many thanks for watching.